compliant, and that's been factored into the spatial coordination. I think it's a fundamental thing. So we're not getting a properly spatially coordinated stage 3 design. Everything gets chucked over the fence into stage 4. The CDP gets chucked over the fence because no one understands that that has to be done to complete the stage 4. And actually, there's an opportunity, going back to what Matt was saying, to now we don't have the crossover with the building safety bill. We won't have the crossover between stage 4 and stage 5. It sets a clear obligation that you get all those CDP guys involved much earlier on in stage 4 to conclude that, because you won't get sign off from anyone to start on site. We're being squeezed from both ends.
I actually printed off the dreaded sheet again this morning, and right at the bottom in small print, it says specialist subcontractor designs are prepared and reviewed during stage 4.
Yeah.
Too late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great.
But I made lots of comments on the REBA stages and say, please put smoke control after fire safety, because everybody ignores it, and it is part of fire safety. But because you've got specialist subcontractor, I mean, I've seen fire strategists just say, oh, we need a smoke control system, speak to a specialist smoke control subcontractor. And that really doesn't help, because if they come back and say, well, that's in the wrong place, that's in the wrong place, what are you going to do about it? And you make it work.
That's happening more and more. We're finding, I mean, specifically, we're finding more projects now that we're involved with where we're having to, the stage 3 information is having to be revisited to introduce changes, fundamental changes, because the stage 4 information doesn't work. So, and at that point, usually we're not getting the input from the architect because of their portion of that is finished as far as they're concerned. So we're then left at a bit of an impasse where we can't proceed, because we need to implement a change without anyone to implement it.
Yeah. Well, I think sorry, I kind of came in slightly after everyone started, but I think all those scenarios that you talked about are things that are happening on, like I said, on my email, a couple of the projects I'm on at the moment, just because the specialists are getting appointed under another specialist, and so on and so forth. So it's sort of very much down the line. But I obviously missed the beginning. I didn't know just whether there was a particular way that you wanted to kind of go through the session today in your mind, or
Richard's internet went down. That's why he couldn't attend the meeting. He's the one who's normally coordinating all this.
Who's that? Richard?
Yeah, Richard.
Oh, it's in another exotic country. That's now kind of gone.
Yeah, his internet went down.
But I think from the summary and all the feedback that's come through, which have been really helpful, I think from my understanding is I'm personally unfortunately not able to attend Digital Construction Week. Well, I say unfortunately, I think I'm on holiday, so that's a good thing, isn't it? So but I think from what George and Richard were saying is that there's going to be a couple of sort of roundtables on the day for people to kind of almost just sort of brainstorm and kind of come out of that with some really nice and useful input. So as I can see from the emails that have come through, as you're saying, Paula, the kind of the gateway 1 and 2 are sort of good constraints in a way. Feels like it on paper, in theory. There's obviously a lot of other hurdles to do with procurement, probably mainly in terms of actually fitting in between those 2 gateways. But I think that the issues that everyone's raised, well, like I said, from a design point of view, there are some kind of improvements that have been happening in terms of, for example, I think I mentioned the fire strategies where the fire consultant has actually kind of taken our model and then almost color coded that, which I think is quite an interest. It's a simple thing to do, but it's so easy to kind of misinterpret something in plan, especially if you've got quite complicated buildings in which in section have got maybe multiple user groups as well, mixed use schemes, different fire strategy requirements from, let's say, retail or supermarket to resi above, for example. So that was something which I think, you know, maybe kind of continue to talk with consultants that you're working on, fire consultants, that might be a nice way to try and improve it. Because also their understanding of the project should be better, therefore, because again, in plan, it's quite easy to miss huge kind of issues to do with, I don't know, simple things like voids, for example, ceiling voids, which might not get picked up in plan. And so you miss a whole raft of detection or suppression or something that you might need. So that was a sort of simple example that I could think of, which with one of the consultants we're working with, they've sort of tried to implement, and that certainly made things a little bit clearer. But I think in terms, like I said, on the live project that I've got at the moment, the smoke control system specialists are only really coming on board now. And Paul, the example that you mentioned is happening where they're like, well, actually, we need a hole here in the RC kind of shaft wall. And like, oh, but it wasn't there in the M&E designs builders work openings because they didn't know that it was needed, or so because they didn't have the specialist input. So we put all the other builders works holes in, and now that the specialists come on board, with maybe, I don't know, let's say, 6 months left to completion, they're saying, oh, we need some slots in the RC. Hopefully they're not too big, so they might be able to accommodate it. But the other one was like the AOV height that needed to be increased, for example. So again, these are quite sort of standard issues that I've come across, but there's no fire strategy, as you say, will set certain things, but sometimes they are contradicted by the specialist, which is fine in a way, but not fine, obviously, if you've got to somehow do something to structural elements of a building, or have to go back into planning to increase the height of something on an elevation or something like that. So, but as I say, Paula and Matt, if the gateway 2, as we understand it, it is in fact that hard to stop, then that can only be beneficial. But obviously the procurement routes need to be rejigged to kind of achieve that. But I think that's one of the things that came out of our last discussions, that that will go down to sort of one of the work streams. But yeah, I mean, from what I can see, just as well, that's kind of the like that, and then the signage that was mentioned. Who was that? Sorry, I've forgot it in there. So Jim. So Jim's note about the signage, and I think that's important as well, because I've seen, for example, in the NHBC, there is now very particular signage about for use by firefighters who come up firefighting shafts or general shafts to be able to see, and that can quite easily get missed because you might have like an interior designer doing the private sale flats. They'll be going on a completely different route, which is aesthetically driven as opposed to compliance driven. So that is another scenario that I've seen on one of the schemes where we've got a mixed affordable and a private part to the building, and the interior team are not aware of it, unfortunately. So that requirement. So that's I think Jim's point on signage and statutory signage is again a very valid thing to highlight. But I don't, to be honest, have anything more to add to that at the moment, to be honest. But obviously, I'm sure some others might do if they want to jump in, because I know just you're recording this, so obviously Richard can also pick up on this, and George at the Digital Construction Week session.
I think one of the concerns that we have, Daz, is the firefighting shaft and the risers, for that matter. We have exactly the same or a very similar concern to the concern that's been picked up well, more prominently since the Grenfell Tower inquiry regarding the cladding system, whereby the risers and the firefighting shaft span through all floors of the building. If we have an issue in any of those walls, we have the potential for the fire to jump straight through and several stories of the building. Now, at present, there isn't the scrutiny over those surrounding walls that there is, say, for example, with the cladding system that we've got currently. And some of the faults that we see in the shaft wall, and specifically the head detail, the interfaces of that shaft wall around the risers, around the firefighting shaft, where quite often 120 minutes is specified. I would struggle to sort of find a sort of that those walls were able to maintain a 30-minute requirement in some situations. We've identified concerns with studs not being engaged in head track, service openings being incorrectly formed, all sorts of concerns with those walls. And like I say, that for me presents quite a serious concern in fire safety.
Yeah, and I think it's almost like default shafts, smoke and fire shafts being either RC or block work. Sort of seems to be the sensible route to take. Something that I always kind of look at in the projects is from an RC package. Actually, the shafts it's very risky to kind of make them out of dry lining as well, because there's too many interfaces that can go wrong, or the rating can go wrong. So, as I say, if you've got the right input in terms of openings and stuff required, creating them out of concrete or block work, because you've got to achieve that non-combustible finish as well, or the linings as well. It sort of seems to be the kind of way to go. And I think just picking up on some of the other things that was in the email about how can best laid plans be undermined by those living in the flats, or those coming and doing subsequent repair or installation works. I think, like an obvious example, the example that's put in is the broadband supplier. Every flat nowadays will just have someone drill. I mean, I had mine done where just drilled in. To be fair, he did put fire seals. I've got no idea what rating they are, but he put something in, and it's not just a kind of a hole. But I don't know the answer to those two questions about, leaving open the doors with fire extinguishers or carpets, undercutting. I don't really know how you would. It's probably easier to manage in, let's say, local authority or kind of housing association stock, to a little bit degree, because if it's privately owned, then they can just sort of do what they want. Whereas maybe with local authority or like I said, leaseholders, etc., typically they will get, you'd hope, someone else to come and do the work. So at least there's an element of, there's a ticket being raised to renew the carpet, so that should then kick in some sort of checklist about, make sure you don't cut the doors down, or if you do need to cut the doors, have they been reinstalled with smoke seals, etc. So yeah, in a way, the private properties within a block might be harder to control, as opposed to stock that's owned by local authorities or housing associations. But I don't really know what the answer to those questions that Jesus raised in his email, to be honest.
There's a lot being done at the moment. I mean, I was speaking to FIS. I've actually just picked it up out of my bag today in regard to marking walls with fire compliant data. So, for example, I don't know whether everyone can see that. That's is an initiative that the FIS and ASFP and GPDA are pioneering at the moment to ensure that all firewalls, as they're being called, are marked with information that can be picked up via a QR code and immediately shows the performance requirement of those walls, and then links it back potentially to the BIM information on the project and showing what system then needs to be installed in remedial works, for example. Just going back on what you were saying, Dad, about the core, I think the thing is, as an industry, we seem to be moving towards the sort of more lightweight core design, so reduction in concrete, reduction in carbon footprint, and shaft wall as a system can provide an incredibly efficient system to produce those risers and firefighting shafts. It just needs to be built correctly. The devil is in the detail with all of these systems. If you don't get the interface details correct, if you don't produce the system properly, you can go from having an 120-minute potential rating to 0. So that's where we need to be emphasizing the importance of making sure that you're building something correctly. Earlier this week, I was subject to I was listening in on a presentation that somebody was giving regarding information and just design information, etc. And one of the things that occurred to me is if you buy a flat pack piece of furniture from IKEA, you get a fairly extensive set of information on how that's put together, showing you exactly how that fits together, what process you need to follow. Yet when we build dry lining, when we're talking about the complete internal passive fire protection in the building, we may have one detail. But say, for example, head connection details. Now, a contractor that we work with mentioned they've got a very extensive quality assurance plan. They go through sort of 85 different quality points to ensure that what they've built is correct. And they recently found on a project that 68% of all of the defects that they had identified were to do with the head detail. Now, I rarely see more than one deflection head detail being issued for a project. And that's an idealistic midpoint on a wall, 2 fillets of board, head channel, and overlap. What happens at a splayed corner? What happens at a T-junction?
Matt, I totally agree. And this is a conversation we used to have back in the day, saying that in terms of the Lego analogy, that what we do is we give our site installation teams the Lego box with a picture on it, but none of the instructions is like, this is what it should look like when you're finished, you know. Absolutely. But how they actually achieve that is just from experience, or because their gaffer's telling them, oh, you put a fix in there, fix in there. So we're working with our consultants to try and take it to the next level of detail and actually do a kit of parts, actually do an assembly drawing, so the pure design for manufacture and assembly. But it's really difficult because we're all spinning plates to try and go into that level of granularity. But I completely agree with where you're at. For details that are safety critical, we need to go into that level of granularity for sure.
I just don't feel that the incentive and the for want for better terminology at the moment, the financial incentive, the budget is there to allow for that. We don't want to think about that early in the project. We want to think about how we can get it through to a point where we can install, how we can get the contractor appointed as quickly as possible and start building. But we're not looking at actually, have we got it right? Have we got it to a point where we're squeezing contractors to the extent that the majority of our fixing workforce, I would argue that the majority of them now, English certainly isn't their first language. And I would say that some of them really struggle with reading the English on technical details and bits and pieces like that. So how can we improve if we're not accommodating that earlier on in the process and clarifying to make sure that we're not going to get built defects?
Yeah, visual representations, exactly as the IKEA thing, so that language isn't a barrier. Yeah, I also think that for 75% of typical details, we can put that together based on our experience of what works well and what doesn't. And then you're talking about, you know, head details. There's only a finite number of ways that we can put it together, and we should be trying to standardize anyway. And then the other 25% where you've got really bespoke, really technically complex arrangements, of course, you've got to put the time and effort into that. But why can't we work together as an industry to build a catalogue of these standard details that we know work, that will deal with certain situations, and that covers 50 to 75% of the issues, and then our time is focused on those little bespoke elements.
Absolutely. I've just seen a message from Alistair mentioning about the practical knowledge of certain design personnel as well, and I completely agree. I mean, one of the requirements that we have is that all of our design consultants have a level of practical knowledge, so that you can. And I've seen numerous details that drawn up. Only yesterday, I was looking over one for a mullion abutment, and there's just no way that it can be built. You have to be able to look at it in the sense that you're piecing that system together and building it in your head to be able to issue that as a practically applicable detail.
Yeah, I remember back to one day when I was dealing with a structural engineer, and he was asking about one of our anchor installations, and he'd basically drawn this up, and it was fixing back a bit of steel. It was a steel column, and it was bolting it back to the wall for some application. And I said to him, I says, yeah, that's fine, that's great. I says, how are you going to install the anchor? He goes, what do you mean? He says, I said, well, how are you going to get a drilling machine in there? I said, there's no space for a drill machine and a drill bit to actually drill a hole for your anchor. So whilst it looks okay on paper, it's thinking, you're right, it's thinking it through and thinking, right, sitting and looking at a design and saying, how can this be installed? Can someone get their hands in there? Can machines, you know, screw guns, drills, cutting machines, can they actually be put in there? And I think that can be certainly one of the things that are missing. And I think that, and going back to the point you made about, you said about things being built properly, I am just absolutely shocked when I go into site and see some of the installations that guys are putting together, even just something like drywall, which is, you know, you think, you know, okay, I know there are things to be followed, but, you know, when you boil it down, it's not rocket science. You know, there are just one or two details you've got to put together. And Paula, your point of having a standard book of details, I mean, there are certainly various publications out there, and some manufacturers do a very good job of having exploded diagrams. For example, British Gypsum's White Book is still, I think, still a very good standard. However, the problem with creating that standard book is manufacturers' details move on. So, for example, and this is something I find quite alarming, is when I deal with some architects and I say to them, you know, we get in discussions, and I ask them, I says, have you seen British Gypsum's latest, their new revised details for service openings? And they go, no. I say, well, you really should. I says, because to be honest, the days of just putting a red line on a drawing and saying 60-minute wall are gone. As a designer, you're going to have to detail the metal framing. That's the level it's getting down to. British Gypsum have severely revised their details, and when I saw them, I looked at it and I went, this ain't going to happen. I mean, just I'll give you an aside. When they do an opening for service openings, that opening has to coincide with two vertical studs. So the vertical studs must form the vertical sides of the opening. And if you have two openings within 300 millimeters of each other, you have to provide an intermediate vertical stud. So in a space of 300 millimeters, you're going to have to put in 3 metal studs. Now, if the wall has been constructed like they have in the past, and they come along and just knock a hole through it for the services, then they're going to have to basically rip the plasterboard off and put in the required number of studs. So even the manufacturers are beginning to move, and they're beginning to beef up some of their details, and things that we've done in the past. You know, we're going to have to look and see, right, what's their latest state of the art. So details that we might have locked in time can very quickly become redundant, because they're not as per the manufacturer's details.
I agree. I think that there needs to be, in my opinion, one of the ways to address this is there needs to be a checklist early on of information that must be available and correct. Mm-hmm. For example, as you mentioned, Alistair, the service opening details, there is a minimum distance requirement between formed service openings.
Yes.
And all too often we see huge sort of openings created, or several openings with one stud between them. And you can't work with that as where it's in direct contravention to the information that's been provided by the manufacturer. So that's where we get into this situation where quite often it's raised, nobody knows what to do about it because it's been left till such a late stage that we've now got labour standing on the job, and it's being questioned. It then goes into a process where it can be waiting for several weeks, and all the time we should be getting on with construction of the building.
I think the thing that I'm a little bit sort of cautious of in terms of that discussion about studs and stuff is that you know, at the moment, for example, typically, let's say wall build-ups are full design packages for the architects, but we certainly don't set out studs. And if we were having to do that as part of that design, that is a huge undertaking, which also requires knowing exactly where things are going to go through that wall as well. And so I'm not sure of the practicality of the designers, and by that I mean sort of the architectural non-specialist in the sense of like the manufacturer, being able to hold all of that knowledge / draw it out or model it, because that would just be well, it could be done, I guess, but again, that will then kick in potentially longer coordination times, or getting those specialists, if it is going to be Guilty or British Gypsum or Knauf or whoever, to be already at the party, because everyone will have slightly different details, right, and slightly different build-up, etc. So yes, while those details may be there, like I said, we would never set out partition. We would obviously include that in a robust specification. The only time where we've had that level of input was on like the volumetric scheme, where the hot and cold roll came through as a model, which allowed us to kind of then look at service penetrations through that. So that's the only time you would, and even that model was super heavy because they put all the studs in it, you know, all the nuts and bolts in. But once they filtered that out, that kind of became useful. And then the final thing I would say is that the again, something that's becoming more and more obvious is that from an M&E consultant, let's say, to do with services going through firewalls, one thing is virtually designing it in a model to do what it is, but obviously, as you said, they generally lack the installation sequencing requirements, or the maintenance or inspection requirements or replacement needs afterwards. So therefore, for example, on a scheme that I'm working on, I did ask the M&E subcontractor, do you not have a design manager who is reviewing the data that's coming, or the designs that's coming from the novated M&E contractor, consultant, to check that it's buildable, or whether you think it's got a better way of building it, because you're ultimately installing it. And no, they don't. And that might be a one-off. It might be typical. I'm not sure, to be honest. But yeah, there's an element of getting, you kind of get into the realms of having to get the installer and their sequence of installing / maintenance requirements into the design of the M&E, to then also, go all the way back to what we're talking about, dealing with penetration, fire-stopping penetrations through partitions. It's there are so many steps removed. It's a bit of a mind boggle. I mean, there's only so many specialists you can bring forward, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think you should detail it to that degree. I mean, this is something for the reasons that you've mentioned, and as well as that, for the reason that it aids the specialist subcontractor to have some degree of flexibility in the dry lining system, be able to space the stubs as required. For example, you look at the specification, it'll have the studs at 600 centers, but when you start building a wall, your first board is against the back edge of that stud. So your 1200 stud isn't at a 1200 center from the stud at the start of the wall. It's half that stud back to allow that board to fall directly down the center point of the stud. But you won't know that unless you're a dry lining fixer primarily, or you've got knowledge of it due to that avenue, if you like. So we've been asked to detail to that level of detail to try and feed into the BIM model to show individual stud locations. It becomes incredibly large, it becomes incredibly cumbersome, then nobody uses it, and ultimately there isn't really any advantage, in my opinion, to doing that. What you do need, however, is the critical stud locations. So, and if not detailed, you need to know where they are. So things like, for example, corner details. The number of times I see a service penetration going through the corner of a wall, and it can't happen. There's no way to do it and maintain the fire rating. You have to have a full height or two full height stubs there to form the corner. Door openings, door jambs should span full height. Service openings, as Alistair mentioned, you need to have the studs there for the service openings, you need to have that minimum distance between. So there's almost a sort of set of rules, sort of certain guidance that you have to have there in principle, and then stud work is formed around that. And I think it's important to sort of acknowledge and raise awareness of that early on in the process.
That was one of the things that I was going to say is the point is everybody assumes that a duct is the size that the duct is, and it never is, because the dampers are always bigger than the duct. You have the specific methods of install. There is now a test method for what we're calling, and I always get it wrong, combined penetrations, where you can put pipes and cables potentially through the same place as a duct and a damper. A duct or a damper. Ducts and dampers and everything don't do the same thing, but at the moment that test is so prohibitively expensive, I can't see anybody doing it. But there is a test method there. But again, just because you can test it doesn't mean that anybody has. And everybody's products are all slightly different. And Alistair made a very good point earlier about everybody's updating their details. But also, before, everybody used to go, oh, actually, that'll be all right. Now everybody won't. And that's the bit you've got to remember. So I think the key thing to say, Andrew, as architects, is understand that everything is actually a lot bigger than you want it to be. You can't just say, let's squeeze everything into this hole and get a bit more lettable space, because actually, when it comes to it, if you've hidden it, people can't go and look at it every year. That's the other issue. So you can't put all the pipes under the ductwork, because you've got to get an access door to get in to clean the duct to look at the damper, and its space is the issue.
No, I agree. And I think this is where the if you look at some M&E models, design models, they are stacked because they're not really in the same way as architects. We don't get enough exposure to things being built on site, I would say, more and more so, not necessarily because of pandemic, but because everyone's working digitally. That site visits is probably getting less, and need to kind of bring that back, I guess, a bit more. But in the same way that M&E designers aren't necessarily in experience in sort of install, they'll get everything to fit virtually, but actually they will have the same inexperience, I guess, of real life as other disciplines could be. And I guess the installation, there's clearly there is a continual emphasis on the site team and the site managers and the inspectors on site to also be rigorous, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of requiring everyone to spot things, flag them up, whether it's a virtual or on site. That's got to be continued, I guess, continual requirement. And I think that's probably going to be even more so because of the need to being able to document layer by layer for the building safety case, or being able to kind of say, yes, we have actually built it because here is a peeling back set of photographs or something like that. And if that picks something up, then that's great, obviously.
I think adding to that as well is site mock-ups. Yeah, so as the earliest point on site, yeah, you're ready to dry line, you get it there, you get your head detail in place, it's all agreed, building inspectors there, documented, it's an exemplar way, then that's how we're going to do it, it's agreed. It's just then managing that process throughout the site on, 1,000 or so walls. But if you've got that head detail that you can point to and say that's what we agreed, then for me that's a really, and that we're just using head detail as an example, but it could be everything within a flat, into socket locations, everything, how that install goes is just agreed as an exemplar. So you used to get that for marketing, showing how wonderful a flat looks, but for me now, the day and age is we look at it from a technical point of view as well. It's not just about how good it looks and the quality of it. It's, are we meeting all those requirements? So yeah, I think site mock-ups work really well. Berkeley Homes do a load of mock-ups and they're really decent, external, internal. They get it agreed. And then they use those images, etc., for lessons learned and moving on for other projects as well. So
I completely agree with that. We work with a contractor who've they've almost finished there. I think now they've been working on Midland Metropolitan Hospital recently, the dry lining fit out. And I visited the site. It must be over a year ago now. And on the entrance, at the entrance point to the site, they've got an area where they built all of their mock-up sections. So they've got a large section just devoted to dry lining, details, interfaces, service openings. Everybody who enters that site, everybody who they bring on in terms of fixers, labourers, goes past that area, and whenever they have an induction, they go through with all of their personnel. This is the agreed benchmark. This is how we're building this interface, and that sort of practical display is invaluable. In my opinion, arguably that should happen on every project. It would certainly reduce defects.
It would be good if you could allow a space as well to have like cutaway sections, so you're not, if that's what they do, it's I'm only talking from my own experience seeing what Berkeley do, but they literally just build an independent section of wall or whatever, so you can go look at it from inside as a section through it, and it just works really well rather than just having the finished product there. So and a little bit of money up front like that, depending how many units your project is, would just be invaluable and save loads moving on.
Absolutely. I think an interesting point was raised previously about the early engagement with the specialist contractor as well. I think that's something that is definitely would certainly see improvements in identifying some of these concerns early on. I think one of the questions that I have though is just relating to the practicality of that early engagement. And the email that I sent out, apologies, just before the start of the meeting, was there are some challenges that we would perhaps need to acknowledge in specialist contractors fulfilling that early engagement requirement, if you like, in that they're often, and in my own experience, more often than not, they're not appointed at that stage, and they're quite away from being appointed at that stage, and therefore any information that they're providing at risk, and that can actually act in detriment to their chances of winning the project. So it's certainly something that I would say is absolutely beneficial, but as an industry, we would need to look at how that would work, what allowances would need to be put in place, and who should fulfill that that requirement, if you like. Who should we be calling upon? Because if we're asking the specialist contractor, and out of the good intentions, they are providing that information, that then goes back out to competitive tender, and all the information that they provided has been at their own cost, and they may not then win the job due to a competitor who's priced it lower.
Yeah, well, I think that's the procurement issue of that, and I think you're absolutely right, Matt, that if you're going to ask people to do it and provide that design, it's a professional design, pay for it, then put it out to tender. If they win it, then you'll get the price for the job to do it, as opposed to the design as well. And smoke control, particularly, as it's been its own worst enemy on that one, in the fact that you end up doing countless designs or quotes which aren't probably the best of designs from some people, and they've picked a kit of parts, and they don't necessarily, the overhead comes in the cost of the parts. But really, it would be much better if it was designed properly, and you will get a much more professional design. You won't get somebody just going, well, it's the same as the one I did last week, we'll do it like that.
Absolutely. I think the early on there isn't enough incentive to put the time investment in. It's about reducing the time involvement and maximising the chances of winning the project, rather than get it right, make sure you've got all the information there, make sure it's correct, so that then when it goes out, it can be followed through, if you like.
Yeah, I think the issue is the procurement route needs to be looked at the front end, from when the client brings on the main contractor, because our hands are tied to bring in CDP guys any earlier, because we usually inherit a design that may or may not be a fully functioning stage 3 design and are expected to launch straight into stage 4. So you've already missed the boat. It's already peppered with risk by the time we're brought on. So we might bring our supply network partners on early, but they're still down the line from when we're brought on. So you almost need to bring in main contractor advice stage 2, so you can influence, or at least certainly early in stage 3, so you can influence those decisions. It's a wholesale switch of mindset that's going to have to come in.
Absolutely. And when I've spoken to architects about this, Paul, and I don't know why isn't it happening, you know, and from the feedback that I've had is that the budget isn't there to allow them to do that. So how do we, I mean, perhaps a sort of slightly very open question at the moment, but how do we sort of allow for that? How do we move forward as an industry to try and it needs to happen?
It's a false economy though, Matt. It's a false economy, because if we can demonstrate cause and effect, the issues that occur and the costs that are assigned to those issues because we haven't been able to coordinate earlier, if we can somehow capture that, and I haven't got the answers, then that's a compelling argument back to the client to say, yes, you'll have to spend up front, just like we have to with BIM, yeah? You have to expend and put all that effort in up front, but you should reap the rewards further down the line. Yeah.
Track your rework and look in your skips to see what you're throwing away.
Yeah. I think it's very
I can't believe, you know, I know that as a manufacturer, and I've gone to the hoops we've been through and the argument over the last 50p on the order, and I'll go to site and there's 5 of them in the skip, and you're just thinking, why was I nailed down on a price like this when 5 of them have just gone in the skip? You know, that's the way to justify it. But you know, you've got to have some quite hot cost accountants looking at it quite thoroughly to do that. But it must be right. If you do it right first time, it must be cheaper.
I think that's the. Like I said, I think these kind of wants and wishes from before are because of the gateways. Are going to have to get crystallized, and it's in a way it's a difficult thing to kind of deal with, but because of the regulations, it's great in a way because it's got to change the system, and that's got to be a good thing. And it may be painful for clients, but as I said, on most of the projects, and just generally speaking, the aim is to kind of start on site quicker, finish earlier to meet some sort of milestone or announcement or whatever. It never really, there's always something that happens, and at the detriment of either the finish or the quality or the and health and safety is obviously the worst one that could get impacted. Because I mean, for example, I'm kind of getting queries from subcontractors going, "Oh, can we propose it?" Like, well, what did you price for? Because it's nothing. It doesn't look anything like what was in our tender. So what did you contractor or specialist actually get a price for to go into the bid? Because if you're asking me whether the gate is sliding or swing, it's like, well, it wasn't an option. There was only one thing that was kind of drawn and specified. So what did you give a price for, and what was used? So or was there one at all? So I think I think the gateways are in a way potentially a great thing to kind of change the system, even though it may be a bit painful for a lot of people. But as you say, Paula, it is a false economy of these sort of non-holistic BE activities, or pretending that we can get something done in 12 weeks when it takes longer or whatever it might be. So no, it's been really interesting to hear everyone's thoughts on that. Is anyone, I guess, on the call which is in having to deal with sort of maintenance, which I'm kind of thinking back to those kind of what happens after it's built? How do we capture things that just humans do? I don't know if anyone is in the call which are having to deal with that kind of thing. I think your QR code is quite an interesting idea, and like barcodes have been used, I guess, quite a lot. But I guess a lot of people aren't going to want lots of stickers also on their walls. But it's a bit of a thing. So sorry, Joe.
Stealing line does. So what tends to happen is that certainly in petitions, the intention is to put them above ceiling lines so that they're in the part of the wall that potentially isn't decorated, but where the majority of the services fall. So to the majority of residents, you wouldn't know they were there, but Obviously, if somebody's up there doing maintenance, they can straight away see that. I think that one of the challenges at the moment is how to make sure that they are there and to a visible frequency without having a continuous tape along the top of every wall. How to make sure that that is easily visible to whoever is going in to do the maintenance.
Well, I can imagine another example where if in a lobby putting notice boards up for residents, that will probably kind of contravene some sort of Class O finish, spread of flame, not necessarily the integrity, or maybe it might because they've kind of drilled through that hole, for example. So you see lots of notices turn up which look great. One of them might be about, here is the fire strategy, but actually that in itself might also not be compliant. Sorry, Joe, you were going to say something.
No, I'm just nodding along because it's all very familiar. Yes.
I wonder whether there's an opportunity, just being brave and being a bit radical, to employ AI so that you've got a digital home user guide. You hold your tablet up to a certain area you want to drill a hole in, and a big red cross comes in and says no, because or watch points. You'd need to fire stop a hole of a certain size, or I mean something like that. That's got to be where we're heading.
But I think that I was just going to say pretty much the same thing, that the photographic ability now, and then you can label the photographs. So you walk along the corridor and here's your access for your fire damper. Here's your access for this. This is your your smoke detector or your fire detector, and that stuff is there. But I mean, I have to say we're all talking about the design function, and I think the actual biggest issue affecting everybody probably is all the legacy stuff that's out there and all the callbacks you're going to get to say, why didn't you do this right? Or what's this? Or so that the digitization of older stuff, which we're talking about in other groups as well, is probably more important. But be aware of it, because you're going to start getting asked these questions, because I'm having to say to people, I've gone somewhere and I've looked at it and it's so awful. And I say, well, speak to the contractor. This has only been here 2 years. Call them back in and fix it, because you can't do anything else. I don't see why they should have to pay. It's not, and it's certainly not the tenants. It shouldn't be at the tenant's cost. So that might be a bit radical for this group, but I think I'm just saying to you to be realistic about this. There are mistakes that have been made.
Well, the other thing, I kind of live in a block of flats, and the sort of newsletters go out and stuff. I know, obviously, public buildings have fire strategy tests and what do you call it, evacuation kind of got the word now, drills. That's it. So you have like the drills and stuff for that, but obviously you don't really have that in residential blocks. But maybe that's something that needs to be brought in, where it's not necessarily, because typically at the moment they're in flat, but some sort of fire updates, or whether it's through communications or whether it's through a particular day every 6 months or something, where the tenants are kind of given some sort of drill almost about certain things that they can and can't do and be mindful of. And you'd hope that because of what happened in Grenfell, they're going to be more mindful to listening about it. And if it's done because tenants might move in and out. So in my block of flats, lots of people are now moving in and out because they're rented properties. So it does have to be fairly frequent. We try to do it by kind of issuing newsletters, and then obviously through like the AGMs and stuff. But obviously not many people turn up because they're not owners. The only owners might turn up, but not the tenants. So maybe something like that has to be brought in, which is currently required in public buildings, offices, etc., or even schools. Obviously, you got the fire drills. Maybe something like that has to be brought in for that the landlords have to organise.
You have to be careful, because most places are built remain in place.
That's what I mean.
And the point about remain in place is that if you lived on one of the other floors, you might just be going to work that day, and that's the time you go to work. You don't even necessarily know that there's a fire, and the building hasn't been designed for one out, all out, because the stairs won't be big enough and everything else. And I'm, you know, I'm absolutely convinced now that pretty much most blocks of flats, and I used to live in one for a while as well, they've probably got a WhatsApp group which says fire on floor 17 and everybody's out, because that's what happened at Grenfell. And you know, you've got to be careful about that, because there's other things that will fall down and cause problems.
I agree in terms of it's not about an evacuation drill, but it's an upskilling or knowledge kind of session. So it's not about getting them out at the same time, saying, well, don't do X, Y, and Z, for example.
Yeah. Well, don't prop the fire doors open. That one doesn't work. Everybody in the world must know that one. I have literally found bicycles and prams in smoke shafts because somebody thought it was a useful cupboard.
Yeah.
So and they've been told, and I know they've been told, but it's unfortunately there's, what does they say? There's now as queer as folk. So.
Yeah, I think the thing is that unless something is a requirement, people aren't going to fulfill it. The other thing is, and Paul and Paul, you mentioned about the sort of AI introduction. Funnily enough, I was at one of the FIS working groups recently, and there was a chap from BSI who was talking about sort of inclusion of a certain device or something that was picked up via electronic devices in sections of wall, so that they could be easily scanned, and therefore anybody could have the app and work out what the requirements of that wall were. I think it's very early stages as far as I'm aware at the moment. If you're interested, I can dig out the chap's details and forward on to you if it's something that you want to have a chat with him about that. But like I say, I think it is happening, but it just needs to gather a bit of speed, a bit more sort of weight behind it in terms of pushing it as a requirement.
I think there's like two small points I'll just make because I'm conscious of time as well. I know there was an earlier presentation by someone that George introduced me to, where like in hospitals, they were, as I say, almost like a bit of a tag or a magnet on a door. If it was left open, then, you know, using Wi-Fi or something, you would basically raise an alarm as such. So that seems like a fairly simple thing to do. So if fire doors are left open for more than 5 minutes, someone would get alerted. Who that will be, who would manage that, who would kind of police that is another question. And I guess if it doesn't already, again, kind of, I guess if you're a landlord, having people who basically walk the flats, I guess, or walk the communal areas and have to do that role more and more so to kind of check, again, something that I do in the kind of block of flats I live in. We kind of, in the kind of the volunteer kind of directors, we kind of just walk around every couple of months, look at bin stores, look at sort of bin chutes, and pick things up with people who are the residents in those particular floors, for example. So, and I'm sure those kind of things happen, but maybe has to become more mandatory and kind of sort of, you know, audited or checked or whatever. Yeah, like I said, I'm kind of mindful of time, so I don't know if anyone else. Stuart, sorry, you got your hand up.
Cool, thanks. Sorry to be a Johnny come lately and then stick my hand up straight away. But I think the bits that I've just caught up on there is really interesting. That it's obviously about what we specify right at the very outset in the BEPS and the EIRs for the benefit and the use of the BIM model. The work that we've been doing with companies, and we're in a number of the tier ones. I've just come out from a meeting with Savills this morning about this. Is using the BIM model for the tagging and making the BIM model available to residents in obviously a very lightweight way, so that you can develop community engagement apps. So Paul, as you said, they're all on WhatsApp, and for sure I think with Grenfell had been a communal way of saying don't evacuate, do evacuate, just floor 3, then that's the way forward, having everything sort of in people's hands on their phones. There are then ways of using those same apps to give simple advice on the testing and the metrics behind fire doors and stuff like that, for the residents association to have an appointed rep to go around and check and see that it's been inspected. And then we are working on some areas of gamification around motivating people to want to report bikes in smoke shafts, or fire extinguishers jamming open bike doors. So almost having a floor by floor mini competition of who can be the most compliant this week. I'm not sure compliance will be the one, but it might be who wants to win the free Domino's pizza this week. Whoever reports the most fire doors that have been jammed open wins, whatever. But what I'm just saying is that there's a lot now where we can take this and get it in the hands of the people that are the tenants, and then the people that also want to know more about the technical stuff from a PPM point of view. So sorry, I've not say come in at the last minute and then just brain dumped.
No, it's fine. Cause I mean, I had a thing on BBC World Service where there's an app, I think, in a number of countries where if you take a photograph of you litter picking and putting it in the bin, it enters you for basically a lottery. Like every time you drop something, you might win might win something, and therefore, I don't know, it's got 1,000 followers on it or something.
And we as an industry need to come to terms with that, because I don't know those of you that got a Fitbit or have ever had a Fitbit, but you see people walking the long way home to try and get to 10,000 steps. I mean, it's just amazing how they're nudging people to just do this stuff. And if we can find a way of doing it, we're onto something.
Yeah, nudge technology.
That's it.
Well, look, I think thanks for everyone's time. And just obviously when Richard and George kind of get hold, I guess if they've got any questions they can ask, and I guess whoever's attending Digital Construction Week can sort of physically partake in all that as well. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Have a good day and weekend, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'll look forward to viewing the recording. See you all.
Speak to you all.
Cheers. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.